As I've pored through the facts, figures, personalities, and functions of the various pieces of the JFK assassination puzzle, it has become useful for me to adopt an analogy in order to organize and explain my thoughts. The proper analogy for an exploration of the JFK assassination and its associated cover-up and planning, for me, is film production. The JFK assassination maps cleanly onto a film production because both involve layered planning, compartmentalized roles, and tight narrative control. It's storytelling, from the lead up to the event to its packaging and presentation to the American public. It really is rather a lot like a movie. A brief preface: these aren't my beliefs, they're my ideas. They're informed by research and critical analysis, but they're still just ideas. They may be wrong, I may be wrong. In either case, I prefer ideas to beliefs because they're easier to change. If I encounter newer, better evidence, I can change what I think because as much as possible I've tried to divest myself emotionally from needing to be right about everything we're going to discuss here. I don't need to be right, but I do need to understand. And this film analogy, video essay, is the result of a sincere desire to arrive at an answer that makes sense. This video essay is reasonably well informed, but it's not impartial. It's biased, because I am biased. I'm acquainted with the work of hardliners like Bugliosi and Manchester. I've got Marina and Lee in my library. I've heard that side of the story. I don't buy it. I don't buy the Warren Commission, which is what those accounts are based on, either. I'll go a step further. I consider those accounts as indefensible fiction in the face of the preponderance of evidence that is available to us today. That's now the fringe alternative theory that belies credulity. If you're a lone nutter in 2025, you're kind of a lone nut. I'm sorry. I'm sure you're a nice guy. I bet you're good at lots of other things. And I respect you. And I respect your right to your perspective. But if it's your position that Oswald acted alone, case closed, nothing to see here, we probably aren't going to find much middle ground. And I can't spend much time arguing with you or trying to convince you. So there's my bias. There's your disclosure. Tune out now or forever hold your peace. Okay, so the JFK assassination as a film production. Who are the players? What are their roles? A top-down exploration, more or less, makes the most sense to me in terms of how we should organize this thing. So let's start with the producer. In the production of a film, the producer is essentially the project's boss. He's the guy who makes the movie happen. He secures financing by raising money from studios, investors, or production companies, or by putting up his own cash. He hires key personnel, the director, the screenwriter, the editor, and sometimes he will help cast the main acting roles. Sometimes he uses his vision to pair a director with a script, or vice versa. If he's financing the thing in part or in full by himself, he has the most to gain if the film is successful, and the most to lose if it flops. So, applying that lens to the JFK assassination, our producer is LBJ, Lyndon Johnson. He's not the creative author of the thing. He didn't write it. He didn't direct it. He doesn't star in it. But he is its chief enabler. He allows the movie to be made by bringing to bear his influence, access, and political capital. A military-industrial complex coup d'etat requires a waiting successor who will go along with the war machine. LBJ, they had to know, would go along. And he did. Almost immediately, literally one day after John F. Kennedy's funeral, he reversed course on JFK's directive to pull out of Vietnam. To be sure, nobody benefited more from JFK's successful assassination than Lyndon Johnson, and nobody would have stood to lose more had Kennedy survived and been re-elected in 1964. Lyndon Johnson would have almost certainly not been the VP nominee for the following reasons. LBJ was embroiled in controversy by late 1963. Corruption scandals were closing in, multiple investigations were circling around him. Bobby Baker, LBJ's protege and Senate aide, was under Senate investigation for influence peddling and corruption. Baker had deep ties to shady defense contractors and organized crime figures. Don Reynolds, an insurance man, testified behind closed doors right after the assassination that Johnson had demanded a bribe via Baker and received kickbacks for defense contracts. There was a real growing concern that Johnson might be criminally indicted or politically ruined by these investigations. He was also becoming a liability in the North. Johnson was very unpopular among Northern liberals and civil rights activists because of his Southern segregationist past. It made him toxic to parts of the Democrat base. JFK needed to shore up support among black voters, unionists, and progressives, groups who were pretty suspicious of Johnson. Add to that the fact that Attorney General Robert Kennedy absolutely hated LBJ. The feud between them was bitter and personal. RFK saw Johnson as morally bankrupt, corrupt, and politically dangerous. RFK's influence in the White House was growing by '63. Many accounts suggest RFK was actively maneuvering to get LBJ off the ticket. Here's some supporting testimony. Evelyn Lincoln, JFK's personal secretary, wrote after the assassination, "As Mr. Kennedy sat in the rocker in my office, he said to me, 'You know, if I'm re-elected in '64, I'm going to spend more time making government service meaningful. I'm going to advocate changing some of the outdated ways, and you must know, Lyndon Johnson will not be on the ticket.'" Clark Clifford, a Kennedy insider, was asked to discreetly look into alternatives to Johnson for vice president in 1964. Multiple journalists and researchers, like Robert Caro, document LBJ's deep paranoia about being dropped and how Baker's investigation was rattling him in the fall of 1963. Johnson was well aware that he might be dropped from the ticket. He saw the wheels turning, felt the distance between himself and the president expanding. LBJ had to be nervous, unstable, and increasingly erratic over the prospect of losing his position and power by the autumn of '63, because just before the Dallas trip, LBJ snaps at JFK aides. He's worried that he's being sidelined. Then just before the assassination, LBJ had a knockdown, drag-out shouting match with JFK over LBJ's friend, Texas Governor John Connally, riding beside the president in the presidential limo. A squabble, some have argued, suggests foreknowledge. In a conspiratorial frame, Johnson had motive and means. He was about to lose the second most powerful office in the world, and he might have even faced criminal charges. But days after the assassination, the Baker case vanished from the headlines forever, and Johnson was sworn in as president, emerging from this close brush with political exile as the most powerful man on earth. Less than 2 weeks after Kennedy's public slaying, LBJ had the Lincoln Continental presidential limousine John F. Kennedy died in professionally cleaned and sent back to Ford to be repaired and modified, thus destroying evidence for posterity in a move that he incredulously justified by arguing that it was easier than getting another limo. Sure, the richest, most powerful nation on earth couldn't possibly swing the acquisition of another presidential limousine. In a quiet, ghoulish act of contempt, LBJ would ride around in that limo for the duration of his presidency, more than 5 years. It serves as the producer's macabre trophy to celebrate his film's success. And I'm going to tell you something. My wife was agnostic on all this coordinated plot stuff until I told her about this limo business. On a dime, she put her fork on her plate, shook her head, and said no. No, he did it. No normal human would ride around in that deathmobile for years. He did it. My God, he did it. Note, I use the phrase coordinated plot, never conspiracy theory. Conspiracy theory is a phrase created as a derisive by the CIA, specifically to discredit critics of the Warren Commission's findings. That's not my opinion. The CIA admits to it in a recently declassified secret memo. That's CIA Dispatch 1035-960, if you wanted to look it up. This document instructs CIA operatives to counter criticism of the Warren Report by referring to them pejoratively as conspiracy theorists in the media. I'm going to say to you that you should not play the language game with these people because language shapes reality. Coordinated plot, not conspiracy theory. Anyway, we see how the producer role fits here for Lyndon Johnson. He's the chief financier. Through influence, access, and political capital, he has the most to gain and the most to lose. He's not a creative force or a detail-oriented day-to-day manager, but he is the showrunner and overseer. Not just an enabler, but the enabler. Moving down the hierarchy of this film production analogy, we've got our director. A film's director is the primary creative force behind a movie. He's responsible for shaping its overall vision and translating the script into a compelling visual story. He guides the performances of the actors, chooses how scenes are shot, and collaborates closely with department heads like the cinematographer, production designer, and editor to ensure that every element supports the intended mood and message. While the producer handles logistics and financing, the director is focused on creative execution. He directs the artistic flow, making thousands of little decisions that determine how the audience, in this case the American public, experiences the film. The only choice for director in our analogy is Allen Dulles. Allen Dulles fits the director role in the JFK as a film analogy with uncanny precision because, like a Tarantino or Scorsese, he excelled at orchestrating complex operations in his field. As the CIA's first civilian director, Dulles presided over the agency during its formative and shadowy years, overseeing coups in Iran and Guatemala and turning the CIA into a machine of regime change, psychological operations, and assassination plotting. He mastered the use of cutouts and front organizations, delegating the messy execution to others while maintaining the strategic vision. This is classic directorial behavior. Dulles's motivations for taking on this proverbial film were personal and institutional. After the Bay of Pigs fiasco, JFK vowed to shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter them to the wind. Kennedy's first step toward dismantling the CIA was to fire Allen Dulles. Dulles, who saw himself as a Cold War sentinel and a protector of national security, viewed Kennedy as dangerously naive and a threat to U.S. global political dominance. Even though Dulles was officially retired, or ousted more accurately, he remained deeply connected to the intelligence world. This dude was respected and feared, and he really never stopped operating behind the scenes. Dulles had deep operational ties to anti-Castro Cuban networks, mafia intermediaries, and hawkish military figures. His global intelligence contacts, institutional loyalty from within the CIA, and pragmatic coldness toward elected officials made him ideally suited to guide a hidden operation with strategic patience. He didn't need to write the script or be present at the filming. He only needed to ensure the right actors, the right framing, and the right tone. Behind all of this was a worldview steeped in moral elitism. Dulles believed in the necessity of an ethical, ideological aristocracy, guys like himself, who would act in the shadows for what was, in their belief, the greater good. They used subversion and even assassination. That's not the mindset of a harmless, dismissed bureaucrat. It's the worldview of a man directing history from behind the curtain. His appointment to the Warren Commission by Lyndon Johnson after the assassination wasn't just ironic, it was a bald-faced conflict of interest. If Alan Dulles is the director in our JFK as a film production analogy, then the casting director, the guy responsible for finding the right talent for key roles, often quietly, but always with surgical precision and absolute decisiveness, has got to be represented by David Atlee Phillips. Phillips was a high-ranking CIA officer, a master of psychological operations, and one of the agency's most skilled handlers of anti-Castro Cuban assets. He operated under various aliases and worked closely with Alpha 66, the DRE, and other exile groups who had tangled relationships with Oswald, especially in New Orleans, and with Oswald's imposter or imposters in Mexico City. Witnesses and whistleblowers, Antonio Veciana among them, have claimed that Phillips was seen meeting with Oswald in the months before the assassination. True or not, Phillips was in a position to identify and manipulate, or fabricate, the patsy. Exactly like a casting director, David Atlee Phillips would have been tasked with identifying operatives with the right background, experience, connections, and deniability to fit certain roles. Assets who could be maneuvered into place without necessarily understanding the full picture or even their precise role within it. Oswald is the most glaring example of David Atlee Phillips' skilled casting ability, but the other roles were chosen with equal care. The whole production depended on his eye for usable talent and his ability to bring that talent on board. Unlike a traditional film production, though, in our analogy, we see how David Atlee Phillips' mastery in deception and psychological manipulation allowed him to cast roles to actors who were sometimes unaware that the camera was even rolling, or that a movie was being made at all. So to recap so far, Lyndon Johnson is producing. He's the chief enabler, most to lose, most to gain. Dulles is our director, is responsible for developing the overall creative vision of this movie. And Phillips is our casting director. He's the guy vetting and positioning players, building the ensemble. The next rung on our ladder is the screenwriter. A screenwriter creates the blueprint for a film, the script, which includes the story, dialogue, characters, and a basic narrative structure. The screenwriter shapes the story's dramatic arc and determines what the audience sees and hears. He builds the emotional and thematic spine of the movie. While others bring the story to life, it's the screenwriter who defines what the story really is, on paper, before a single frame is even shot. That man, in our analogy, is James Angleton. As CIA counterintelligence chief, Angleton wasn't directing movements or casting operatives, but he was deeply involved in managing the narrative architecture, the control of information, the curation and suppression of intelligence, and the weaving of disinformation into truth so tightly that no one could tell them apart. Like a paranoid screenwriter lost in his own script, he saw layers within layers.
It's a mystery! It's a mystery wrapped in a riddle inside an enigma!
Angleton painted potential plots in every corner. His job was to guard against foreign penetration, but he was probably just as interested and probably spent just as much energy crafting the cover story of American innocence. Angleton wasn't writing a single clean script for public consumption. He was crafting a labyrinth, one where the proliferation of competing narratives serve to protect the core truth from ever really being probed by overwhelming it with misdirection and noise. After the assassination, Angleton played a key role in sequestering Oswald's CIA file and limiting interagency transparency. If someone needed to create a plausible backstory for Oswald, one that could withstand scrutiny but not really lead anywhere, Angleton would be the guy to do it. He understood how to manipulate timelines, obscure connections, and maintain the internal logic of deception. It reminds me of what Huxley warned us about in Brave New World. Misinformation isn't going to be the problem. There's going to be so damn much information that nobody knows what to pay attention to, and nobody will have the first clue as to meaning. That's why the Minox spy camera is logged into evidence when Oswald is arrested, then disappears physically, but not on paper. It's explained as a clerical error, which is an obtuse explanation. Obviously, it's why Oswald had 2 wallets, neither of which are known to still exist in evidence anywhere. It's why the FBI showed up at the funeral home with the Carcano rifle after Oswald was whacked by Ruby. They took obscene photos of Oswald's corpse holding the gun, they said, to see how it fit. And then, lo and behold, we've got a latent palm print on the bottom of the stock. It's why the limo was effectively ruined as evidence in early December, barely 2 weeks after the murder. And it's not incompetence. Once, maybe twice, we could write off as simple bureaucratic incompetence, but the improbabilities have a way of stacking upon each other, and in pretty short order, we get to a place of statistical impossibility. It's no clerical error. None of this is a mistake. It's deliberate muddying of the waters by a master distortionist who ensured that the dangling threads were left in plain view. And these threads, they're not just loose. They've been cut. Layer upon layer of distraction. The story is built of facts and lies, and nobody knows where to look. It's a genius complication of the narrative by an old counter-intel pro, Angleton, and he wrote this maze of a script to confounding perfection. Angleton believed in what he called the wilderness of mirrors, a world where deception was so thick and recursive that even intelligence professionals couldn't tell truth from fabrication. As CIA chief of counterintelligence, he wasn't just protecting secrets, he was curating and creating confusion on purpose, by design. It's his whole job description. Okay, so we've got our producer, we've got our director, we've got our casting director, and we've got our screenwriter. So who is actually responsible for making sure the thing gets done? It's the line producer. He handles gritty, practical logistics, hires specialized crews, manages their budget, secures locations, gathers material and supplies, and keeps the production on schedule, far from the public face of the project. He's not the visionary like the director, or the idea man like the screenwriter, and he doesn't have nearly as much to gain or lose as the producer. He's the guy who gathers the nuts and bolts and wrenches and super skilled wrench turners. He tells them where to stand, what to do, and when. He makes sure the thing happens how and when it's supposed to happen. And our line producer? An obscure figure called William Harvey, an experienced line producer with blood on his hands way before the events of 11/22/63. He's the icy and indispensable figure who knows how to get things done, especially as it pertains to clandestine violent operations. He's not the grand enabler like Johnson, and he's not shaping the narrative like Angleton, but he's the guy who gets a competent, experienced, professional crew together. He lines up the location, secures the props, and outlines in detail how the plan is to be carried out operationally. William Harvey makes sense for this role because he was the boss of the CIA's ZR rifle program, which was essentially the agency's euphemism for its black ops assassination capability. While the CIA does not confirm involvement in any as-yet declassified documents, ZR Rifle is strongly suspected to have effected the assassinations of Trujillo, the dictator of the Dominican Republic, and Lumumba, the leader of the Congo, both of whom were killed in 1961. When Operation Mongoose kicked into gear after the Bay of Pigs, William Harvey was the guy tasked with ramping up sabotage and assassination efforts against Fidel Castro. This included creating partnerships with mobsters like Johnny Roselli, Sam Giancana, and Santo Trafficante, working to make deals with these organized crime figures that involved offers of suitcases of untraceable U.S. taxpayer cash in exchange for contract hits in Cuba. This isn't even a theory. It's not my opinion. This is admitted to in recently declassified documents. The CIA worked with the mob to arrange for the murder of political opponents in a foreign country. It happened. Here we see how it's not a CIA versus mafia narrative. That's another layer of distraction, something we get lost in. CIA and the mafia are the same thing in some limited sense. To be sure, they worked together toward a common goal as it pertained to Cuba and communism. One was the agent of the other. This all happened within the same ecosystem of cutouts, deniability, and underworld logistics that could, and in all likelihood would, be redirected with the right push from the right showrunner, namely LBJ, backed by the intelligence apparatus and the military-industrial complex, toward a domestic target like John F. Kennedy, whose peace pivot was increasingly seen by hawks as treasonous to U.S. Cold War aims. You've got to remember, $168 billion was spent by the U.S. in Vietnam. Adjusted for inflation, it's more than $1 trillion in today's money. That doesn't happen if JFK makes good on his back-channel communication with Khrushchev, in which he expressed strong desire to end the Cold War and stop the space race in favor of collaboration with the Russians on the moon mission. These guys, JFK and Khrushchev, in their private letters, even discussed dismantling and destroying their nuclear arsenals. On October 11, 1963, a little more than a month before the assassination, President Kennedy signed National Security Action Memorandum 263, which authorized the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Vietnam and directed the South to take over their own defense. The military-industrial complex could not tolerate that. 4 days after the assassination, less than 24 hours after JFK's casket was interred at Arlington, LBJ signed National Security Action Memorandum 273, which essentially undid JFK's pullout directive and put us back on a path of escalation in Southeast Asia. By the time Kennedy was trying to smooth things over with the Soviet Union while exploring back-channel peace with Cuba and explicitly plotting to rein in the CIA, William Harvey, our line producer, had already been reprimanded for insubordination for sending sabotage teams to Cuba without authorization, just as Kennedy was trying to calm tensions. Harvey hated the Kennedy brothers, and they hated him, but he still held tools, networks, skills, training, and a temperament ideal for executing complex, clandestine, wet operations. So in the film of the assassination, if Angleton is working to craft the script to create layers of ambiguity, and if Dulles is directing the thing, then it's Harvey who's working with the crew that actually makes it happen on the ground on the day. He scouts the hitmen, he arranges the getaway routes, he sets the schedule for chaos. Good book, by the way. Crucially, Harvey doesn't need to be in the credits. He's one of those names you find deep in the production notes, an unremarkable figure at a first glance, but once you understand the nuances of his professional experience, you realize no limited conspiracy between powerful individuals and powerful institutions would have happened without him. He's the natural choice to coordinate an ambush in Dealey Plaza. Every big budget flick needs a studio executive with his finger on the pulse of the project. Ours is J. Edgar Hoover. Hoover didn't just run the FBI, he was the FBI. By 1963, he had been its director for almost 40 years, cultivating a culture of secrecy, loyalty, and surveillance. Hoover had dirt on everyone, from presidents to movie stars, and he used that leverage to maintain unchallenged institutional dominance. Think of him as the head of a major studio who controls the PR, legal, and distribution arms, more focused on protecting the system than promoting the truth. In the context of the assassination, he hated the Kennedys. Especially, he loathed Bobby, his nominal boss, and he viewed JFK as reckless. Hoover had ample knowledge of Oswald years before the assassination, but he acted with baffling detachment after the shooting, and he worked behind the scenes to prop up the lone nut narrative while undercutting the FBI and CIA's acute awareness of Oswald and downplaying the files they kept on him. When the shooting occurred, Hoover immediately declared Oswald the lone gunman within hours and told LBJ the case was essentially closed and that it was important to ensure that the public accepted Oswald as the only culprit. Under his guidance, the FBI handled and controlled key evidence in this case, and that shaped what the Warren Commission would even have access to. Hoover had his hands in post-production also. He leaked or redacted or suppressed material in order to ensure that the final cut fit the official studio line. In our film analogy, Hoover isn't the creative force, he's not the trigger puller, and he's not even an ideologue. He's the one in the executive suite making sure the project doesn't tank, keeping the investors happy, and most importantly, ensuring that no one looks behind the curtain. When rumors of reshoots or multiple directors leak, Hoover buries them, sends out cease and desist letters, and denies there was ever a different script. Okay, we've got our producer, our screenwriter, our director, our casting director, our line producer, and our studio exec. Now, the star of the show, the leading man. And it's the JFK assassination, people. But the star is not John F. Kennedy. He's not the lead in the sense of screen time or narrative control. JFK is the tragic figure whose death sets the plot in motion, the charismatic and ambitious leader cut down in his prime, a guy whose hopes and flaws shape this entire drama. He's a sad symbol of destiny betrayed. That's another good book, by the way. The star of this show is a guy you know as Lee Harvey Oswald. We use all three names so that everyone knows he's a very bad boy. Same as we call John Wilkes Booth, James Earl Ray, Mark David Chapman, and John Wayne Gacy by their full names. Again, guys, language shapes reality. We do this as a way to separate these people from proper society, to other them, to create psychological distance from them and us, and as a way to underscore their naughtiness. It's dehumanizing by design, subtle but dehumanizing, and it helps us to condemn them reflexively. I'm not talking about the other three namers in this video, but I am going to try hard to extend some measure of dignity in my coverage of Oswald on this channel by referring to him simply as Lee Oswald, if I can keep myself disciplined against popular convention to do so. Lee Oswald. Two names. Just a man used in a game he didn't understand the rules to. Lee is the star of the show, Not because he's the richest, most handsome, or most powerful person involved, but because it's his face on the poster when the thing comes out in theaters. He's the central figure around whom the drama pivots, the character whose arc the audience is forced to follow, whether it reflects the true story or not. And it doesn't. He's the public face of the narrative. As soon as JFK is shot, Oswald becomes the story. From the moment he's arrested in the Texas theater, the spotlight is on him. He's marched in front of cameras, denied a lawyer, interrogated for hours on end, during which he emphatically denies shooting anyone. And even though he's barely allowed to speak to media, he manages to tell the world, "I'm just a patsy," before he's hauled away and ultimately gunned down on live TV, silenced forever. The show is centered on Lee Oswald, even as the audience senses something is off. He's the lone nut whose identity defines the official version of events, whether or not he pulled the trigger. And to be really clear, my analysis is strongly biased against this quack theory. Oswald was on the second floor drinking a Coke. That's where Patrolman Marion Baker and Texas School Book Depository Superintendent Roy Truly find him 90 seconds after the shots rang out in Dealey Plaza. Not on the 6th floor, in a sniper's nest, not huffing and puffing, out of breath as though he just shot the most powerful man on earth and sprinted across a room and down several flights of stairs without being seen or heard by anyone. Oswald is calm, confused, drinking a Coke on the 2nd floor. He fired 0 shots. That's my position based on where I'm at in my research and analysis. But that has evolved substantially over time. I was once, embarrassingly, a lone nutter, back before I really read anything. Then I was a shoot and miss guy. But the preponderance of evidence to me now suggests that Oswald was a total patsy, contrived, a low-level intelligence asset earmarked to take the fall. Oswald is perfect for the role of fall guy, the one he's been cast for, because he's been built up as a walking contradiction. He's this enigmatic, oddly compelling figure, the moody 24-year-old loner who likes to read Marxist literature in his spare time, the disaffected Marine who defects to the Soviet Union, almost certainly as part of a CIA operation that involved many false defectors in the late 50s and early 60s. Oswald, the guy who later tries to cozy up to the FBI and CIA. He passes out pro-Castro literature in New Orleans while trying to make contacts among anti-Castro operatives. This guy is politically ambiguous, to say the least. Marina Oswald, Lee's wife, or widow, said she was confused after the shooting because she thought Lee liked John F. Kennedy. And why would he shoot the liberal if he's ultra-left himself? They never explain motive. Lee supposedly took a shot at General Edwin Walker, a hard right-winger and segregationist, months before the JFK assassination. Following the golden rule of life, which is to put yourself in someone else's place and ask, what would I do? The narrative report of Lee's behavior, an equal opportunity political assassin who pops off on right-wing racist hawks and left-wing peace pushers, makes no sense. Even the most extreme ideological strands of your fried mind can't really reconcile this thing. What does Oswald believe? Who or what does he support? What does he resist? Oh well, we really can't tell. Must just be a kook. It's devious and awful, but it's also really good casting. Masterful storytelling. Because we can't see ourselves behaving in such stark, contradictory terms, it paves the way for us to paint Lee broadly with the nutcase brush. It helps the obvious inconsistencies melt away in the public consciousness. People understand crazy as a force of nature. So the idea that crazy did it, that's the official line, that excuses away a lot of the noise, so far as busy people with careers and mortgages and families to raise are concerned. Every great film about a frame-up job or cover-up relies on one key ingredient: the plausibility of the fall guy. If Oswald seems too capable or too incompetent, the story breaks. But if he's just credible enough, just disturbed enough, just politically suspicious enough, and just lucky enough, the audience can be pushed to accept the official cut of the film with the right marketing and post-production editing. The real power of a star isn't in control, but in impact. The whole story works around Oswald's actions and identity, and his role doesn't even have to be real. It just has to be believed. And it is. Oswald's performance shines because he's not acting. Dulles captures Oswald's authentic shock and dismay on camera as whatever script he's memorized violently deviates from the final version of the story, a draft Oswald was never allowed to read. The mastery of the casting of actors in this flick is the degree to which their awareness is crafted by limited knowledge, misdirection, and compartmentalization. Jack Ruby is our co-star. He doesn't have the most screen time, but his entrance is dramatic, emotionally charged, and pivotal to the entire plot. If Oswald is the lead actor, Ruby is the unscripted wild card who changes the ending and meaning of the story, and in so doing, manages to steal the final act. Ruby is the disruptive element that shifts the entire tone and arc of the story. Just when the narrative might have clarified, with Oswald scheduled to give a 1-hour press conference to the media later that day, Ruby bursts onto the scene and whacks him live on national television. It's an unforgettable twist. No writer of fiction would dare pitch it. Too on the nose. But it happened. And people, that's a co-starring performance to rival Anthony Hopkins in Silence of the Lambs. The rest of the players are character actors. Cast and crew, caterers, vendors, people hired to do a job, the larger implications of which most of them could not conceivably imagine. You've got figures like Secret Service Director James Rowley or General Curtis LeMay, who's described as blowing big mushroom clouds of celebratory cigar smoke in the gallery of Kennedy's autopsy at Bethesda Naval Hospital. And these guys may constitute executive producers in our analogy, people whose ties to the military-industrial complex and contempt for peace-pitching liberals like JFK certainly helped to create an atmosphere where a film like this could be conceived of and crafted. I'm not going to do an entire credits list here. I can't. But we've identified the major players, I think. All except for one. That's the editor. The editorial team who shaped this drama is the Warren Commission, established by Lyndon Baines Johnson. The Warren Commission is our editor in my film analogy because it's the body that assembles the footage, cuts together the scenes, orders retakes in the form of follow-up interviews, often given under duress, and ultimately, it's the Warren Commission that delivers the final cut of the assassination narrative to the public. Just like a film editor, the commission didn't write the script, shoot the footage, or act it out, but it had the power to decide what the audience would ultimately see. It shaped the raw material of witness testimony, the physical evidence, the FBI and CIA and Secret Service reports, and the press narratives, all this slop, into a coherent, consumable story. Namely, that Lee Oswald acted alone, that there was no conspiracy, case closed. Don't forget to call him by all three names, friends and neighbors. He's a very bad boy. Nothing else to see here. Don't ask about George de Mohrenschildt. Don't ask yourself why Lee Oswald doesn't need a pistol before the assassination, but races home for one after. Don't mind the mail-order rifle that conveniently creates a paper trail when any gun shop in the state would have legally sold Lee a rifle for cash with no background check or ID required. Cash over the counter. Here's your gun. That was the law. Don't attempt to think. or depression might occur. The Warren Commission is a certain kind of editor, the kind who's under intense studio pressure, because the Warren Commission was appointed by the film's producer, LBJ, and it operated within boundaries and goals that Johnson and his administration set. So there were scenes that the Warren Commission trimmed, like testimonies that went unpursued, or takes they completely ignored, like conflicting medical evidence and unorthodox witnesses. There were subplots they refused to include at all, like the CIA's activities, or anti-Castro operations, or Oswald's questionable background. The Warren Commission was not an editor with full creative freedom, but rather an editor who was trying to deliver a film that would pass censorship, studio expectations, and the test of public confidence. And who do we have pulling double duty here? You guessed it, Allen Dulles, the CIA director and the director of our film. The guy fired by John F. Kennedy over the Bay of Pigs disaster, the exiled and disgraced 600-pound covert intelligence guerrilla who hated Kennedy and never forgave his dismissal, is somehow inexplicably installed by LBJ to serve on the Warren Commission, to make sure the revision work reflects the right story. The idea that Dulles, this shadowy intelligence figure who was fired by Kennedy, is now investigating the man's assassination is almost laughable. No writer of fiction would try to get away with that in a novel, but they did it in real life. And it placed Dulles in a perfect position to shape the public narrative of Oswald as the lone gunman with no discernible ideology, just a nut. Dulles was installed to filter witness testimony and protect institutional interests, not so much unlike a controlling director monitoring and shaping the final cut of a controversial film. Dulles, the director sitting among his team of loyal editors on the Warren Commission, piecing together the final cut of his dramatic masterpiece. The film is a success. The producer and his investors profit enormously. Caesar is remembered as a martyr. They put his face on a coin. The bad man with 3 names is dead, and soon the assassin who shot the assassin loses his marbles, and then he dies too, after being visited in prison without supervision by Dr. Lewis Jolly West, a prominent psychiatrist and key figure in the secret CIA mind control program, Project MK-Ultra. And Ruby dies before he can tell the truth he promised to tell, if he could be taken to safety, away from Dallas. Just another coincidence, like the murder of Sam Giancana and John Roselli after they were subpoenaed by the House Select Committee on Assassinations, or like de Mohrenschildt opting out the day before he was scheduled to testify. Loose threads, cut threads, everywhere you look. What a movie. No screenwriter would dare scribble it, but America lived it, and the cynical wound it opened up has never really healed. These have been my thoughts and ideas as of this writing, subject to change as newer and better evidence becomes known. A parting piece of advice: don't believe everything you think. Keeps you honest as an interpreter. Thanks for tuning into this one, guys. If you made it this far, you must not have hated it. Or maybe you hated it a lot, and you're still typing your novel-length rebuttal. Either way, I appreciate you. Subscribe if you like, and as always, be kind to the world as you bump into it. Peace.